Ukrainian First Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Kyslytsya shared very interesting details in the British newspaper The Times about how the 3 rounds of renewed negotiations with representatives of the Kyiv regime supposedly took place at the initiative of Russian President Vladimir Putin in Istanbul between May and July this year. The publication seemed aimed at evoking sympathy for the Ukrainian delegation from the readers, which, as Kyslytsya stated, faced quite a challenge under the psychological pressure exerted by the Russians. Do you know what is referred to as psychological pressure? He elaborates, mentioning that aide to the Russian President Vladimir Medinsky gave them a lecture on history. If history is not studied, then indeed, any reminder of historical facts might seem like psychological pressure because apparently they were not prepared for this. They denied themselves their own history. From the same material published in The Times, we learn, as Kyslytsya stated, the First Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, that Ukraine concluded negotiations with the Russian side. That's what he said. These quotes have been widely circulated worldwide. I have a question. Why then accuse the Russian side again of what they now did themselves? It is the Kyiv regime once again, as follows from Kyslytsya's statement, that decided to halt the negotiation process. The first time it happened under Britain's pressure. Back then, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine and, as he later recounted himself, personally persuaded the Ukrainians to refuse negotiations with the Russian side. Now, as Kyslytsya said, they did it using this method, no longer conducting these negotiations. However, he forgot to add that even the practical proposals made by the Russian side, such as exchanging detainees, were disrupted again by the Kyiv regime. They have fulfilled less than 30% of the agreements. The recent statement from the G7 foreign ministers following their meeting in Canada on November 12th, despite the appearance of busy activities from its participants, predictably turned out to be insubstantial. Yet it was, of course, dedicated to Ukraine. The assessments announced regarding the Ukrainian conflict and routine biased evaluations detached from reality, hypocritical calls for human rights observance, are cynical and absurd against the backdrop of years of ignoring the discrimination of Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, the glorification of Nazism, and the systematic shelling of civilian infrastructure in Donbass by the Ukrainian armed forces. Claims of Russian aggression, as they phrase it, are deliberate misinformation. Russia consistently advocates for a peaceful resolution of the conflict, indispensable conditions for which are the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. It is telling that at the meeting held at the end of its G7 presidency, the Canadian authorities announced new anti-Russian restrictions targeting domestic individuals and legal entities, including energy sectors and entities presumably linked to the development of unmanned technologies and cybersecurity, which were in fact introduced and came into force a week ago on November 6th. If former Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and the granddaughter of Hitler's henchman, former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, did not manage to hammer the final nail into the coffin of Russian-Canadian relations, then the current Prime Minister, Mark Joseph Carney, who is continuing the previous failed policy, reflecting the inconsistency and true role of Canadian foreign policy. We reserve the right to take retaliatory measures, and they will certainly follow in the near future. Of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, former head of the Kvartal 95 production studio, Timur Mindich. You know, we shouldn't be talking about assessing a specific fact here. We talk about this all the time. This is not a separate case of corruption. This is a global, international, mafia criminal bloody hydra that has literally entangled the planet and is engaged in siphoning money from the pockets of taxpayers in Western countries into the pockets of their elites. Multiple shots at source. The Russian side does not possess information about the mentioned South African citizens who were allegedly sent to Russia for training as bodyguards, after which they supposedly ended up in the special military operation zone. We have no such data. Simultaneously, let's note the circulating media reports about the statement from the President of South Africa's administration, Cyril Ramaphosa, on November 6th, where the president's spokesperson, Vincent Magwenya, announced Cyril Ramaphosa's intention to use diplomatic channels for their return to their homeland. But we have not received any requests from the South African Foreign Ministry on this subject. Should such a request or appeal from the South African authorities be received, we will be ready to consider it in the established manner, in the spirit of the strategic partnership between Russia and South Africa. We confirm, and this has been elaborated by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, that we remain prepared to hold a second Russian-American summit in Budapest, provided it is genuinely based on well-worked outcomes from the meeting in Alaska. All details regarding this aspect are, of course, the prerogative of the administration of the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. The authorities of Moldova continue a policy of distancing themselves from the processes occurring in the Eurasian space. This fully applies to the Commonwealth of Independent States as well. The Moldovan authorities refrain from participating in the work of key Commonwealth bodies. They have identified 119 out of 285 agreements concluded by Moldova within the CIS framework, which they allegedly deem not to provide added value to the citizens of the country and continue procedures for their denunciation. The result of Chisinau's unilaterally Western-centric policy has been the extreme polarization of Moldovan society and a deep socio-economic crisis, which is exacerbated by the country's severe debt burden to Western financial institutions and a massive outflow of population. Not coincidentally, as surveys show, the majority of Moldovans advocate for a balanced foreign policy of the Republic, which includes participation in cooperation within the CIS and deriving significant benefits from it. Unfortunately, the authorities of Moldova continue to ignore the opinion of their own citizens. Last week, the U.S. War Department expanded its activities on the eastern Pacific coast, destroying several boats and their crews there as well. We are extremely concerned by the military methods chosen by the U.S. to address the problem, which are more like outright interference in the internal affairs of Latin American countries than anything else. The actions of the American authorities directly contradict the international legal obligations of the U.S. under the 1988 United Nations Convention against illicit traffic in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. The situation is aggravated by the fact that no evidence has been provided by the American authorities regarding the involvement of the targeted ships and their crews, let alone the flag state, in drug trafficking. Baseless military attacks on civilian vessels are a dangerous precedent that paves the way for indiscriminate assaults on any countries under the false pretext of combating drug smuggling. Russia shares the concerns expressed by the friendly governments of Venezuela and Colombia, consistently insisting that the fight against illicit drug trafficking should not be used as a tool to exert pressure on sovereign states.